The summer of 1969 marked a turning point in American consciousness, shattering the idealistic vision of the 1960s counterculture movement with acts of shocking violence that seemed to emerge from its very heart. Between August 9 and 10, 1969, a group of young people under the influence of Charles Manson committed a series of brutal murders in Los Angeles that would become synonymous with the dark side of the hippie movement and forever change how America viewed cults, charismatic leadership, and the potential for ordinary people to commit extraordinary evil. The murders of actress Sharon Tate, coffee heiress Abigail Folger, hairstylist Jay Sebring, writer Wojciech Frykowski, and student Stephen Parent at 10050 Cielo Drive, followed by the killings of grocery store executive Leno LaBianca and his wife Rosemary the next night, represented more than random acts of violence. They were the culmination of a complex web of psychological manipulation, apocalyptic beliefs, and criminal enterprise that had been developing for years under Manson's leadership. Charles Millis Manson was born on November 12, 1934, in Cincinnati, Ohio, to Kathleen Maddox, a 16-year-old alcoholic prostitute who would struggle throughout her life with addiction and criminal behavior. From his earliest days, Manson was exposed to instability, violence, and criminal activity that would profoundly shape his psychological development and worldview. Manson's father was allegedly Colonel Walker Henderson Scott Sr., though this was never conclusively established. The absence of a stable father figure and his mother's chaotic lifestyle meant that Manson experienced constant upheaval during his formative years. Kathleen's inability to care for him led to Manson being shuffled between relatives and eventually placed in foster care and juvenile institutions. The institutional settings where Manson spent much of his youth were harsh and often violent environments that further damaged his already fragile psychological development. Reform schools in the 1940s and 1950s were often more focused on punishment than rehabilitation, and Manson learned to survive through manipulation, violence, and the cultivation of a carefully crafted persona designed to intimidate others. During his time in various institutions, Manson demonstrated early signs of the manipulative abilities that would later define his criminal career. He learned to read people's weaknesses and exploit them for his own benefit, developing a sophisticated understanding of human psychology that he would later use to control his followers. His intelligence was evident, but it was channeled toward criminal and manipulative ends rather than constructive purposes. By his late teens, Manson had established a pattern of criminal behavior that included theft, robbery, and various schemes designed to exploit others. His early criminal career was marked by periods of incarceration punctuated by brief periods of freedom during which he would commit new crimes. This cycle of crime and punishment became a defining feature of his adult life and provided him with extensive experience in institutional settings that he would later use to his advantage. During his various incarcerations, Charles Manson was exposed to a wide range of ideas and influences that would eventually coalesce into the bizarre belief system he would use to control his followers. His time in federal prison during the 1960s was particularly formative, as he encountered various philosophical and religious movements that were gaining popularity during that era. Manson became fascinated with Scientology, studying its techniques for influencing and controlling people's minds. While he never became a committed Scientologist, he absorbed many of its ideas about mental manipulation and psychological control that would later prove crucial to his ability to dominate his followers. The Scientology emphasis on auditing and mental conditioning provided him with specific techniques for breaking down psychological barriers. He also studied various Eastern religions and philosophical movements, selectively adopting elements that could serve his purposes while ignoring aspects that emphasized compassion, nonviolence, or ethical behavior. His approach to these teachings was entirely self-serving, focused on finding ways to justify his desire for power and control over others. The emerging counterculture movement of the 1960s provided Manson with additional ideological material to work with. He incorporated elements of hippie philosophy, environmental concerns, and anti-establishment sentiment into his developing worldview, but twisted these generally peaceful movements to serve his violent and megalomaniacal purposes. Perhaps most significantly, Manson became obsessed with the concept of an impending race war, which he termed Helter Skelter, after a Beatles song. This apocalyptic vision became central to his belief system and would ultimately provide the justification for the murders his followers would commit. His interpretation of popular culture, particularly music, became increasingly paranoid and grandiose, with Manson convinced that various artists were speaking directly to him through their work. Upon his release from federal prison in 1967, Charles Manson found himself in San Francisco during the height of the Summer of Love. The counterculture movement provided him with the perfect environment to begin recruiting followers, as thousands of young people were experimenting with alternative lifestyles, drug use, and communal living arrangements that made them vulnerable to his manipulation. Manson's first recruit was Mary Brunner, a 23-year-old librarian who was initially drawn to his apparent knowledge of philosophy and music. Brunner's involvement with Manson marked the beginning of what would become known as the Manson family, though it would take time for the group to develop into the criminal organization it would eventually become. The recruitment process that Manson employed was sophisticated and targeted specific types of individuals who would be most susceptible to his influence. He particularly sought out young women who were estranged from their families, struggling with drug problems, or searching for meaning and belonging in their lives. These vulnerable individuals were perfect targets for his manipulation techniques. Manson's commune began to attract a steady stream of followers, many of whom were drawn by his apparent charisma and the promise of a family-like environment where they would be accepted and cared for. The group lived in various locations around California, often squatting on abandoned properties or living in vehicles, creating an intentionally unstable lifestyle that increased the followers' dependence on Manson for security and direction. The introduction of drugs, particularly LSD, became a crucial element in Manson's control system. Regular drug use, combined with sleep deprivation, poor nutrition, and constant psychological manipulation, created a state of mental confusion and dependency among his followers that made them increasingly susceptible to his influence and direction. As the family grew, Manson established himself as an absolute authority figure who demanded complete obedience from his followers. He created elaborate rituals, assigned specific roles to different members, and gradually introduced increasingly criminal activities that bound the group together through shared guilt and mutual dependency. In 1968, the Manson family established their primary base of operations at Spahn Ranch, an abandoned movie set in the Santa Susana Mountains northwest of Los Angeles. The ranch, which had once been used for filming Western movies and television shows, provided the perfect isolated environment for Manson to exert total control over his followers while developing his criminal enterprises. Spahn Ranch became the center of a complex social system that Manson had designed to maximize his power and control while minimizing the likelihood of defection or resistance from his followers. The physical isolation of the ranch made it difficult for members to leave or maintain contact with the outside world, while the communal lifestyle created intense social pressure to conform to group norms and expectations. Daily life at the ranch was structured around Manson's needs and desires, with followers assigned various tasks ranging from maintaining the property to engaging in criminal activities designed to support the group financially. The women in the group were often required to engage in prostitution or other sexual services, while male members were involved in drug dealing, theft, and various scams. The social dynamics within the family were carefully managed by Manson to prevent the formation of relationships or loyalties that might compete with devotion to him. He encouraged sexual promiscuity among his followers while maintaining strict control over all romantic and sexual relationships within the group. This manipulation of intimate relationships was a crucial element in maintaining his psychological dominance. Manson also used various techniques to break down his followers' sense of individual identity and replace it with complete identification with the group and its mission. These techniques included constant indoctrination sessions, the use of drugs to alter consciousness, and the gradual introduction of increasingly extreme ideas and behaviors that normalized violence and criminal activity. The ranch became a center for planning and preparing various criminal activities, ranging from petty theft to more serious crimes including assault and eventually murder. Manson used these criminal activities not only to support the group financially but also as tests of loyalty and commitment that bound his followers to him through shared criminal liability. Central to understanding the Manson family murders is comprehending the bizarre apocalyptic philosophy that Manson developed and used to justify his criminal activities. Helter Skelter, named after a Beatles song that Manson believed contained hidden messages directed at him, represented his vision of an impending race war that would devastate American society and ultimately place him in a position of supreme power. According to Manson's interpretation, the Beatles were prophesying a coming conflict between black and white Americans that would result in the destruction of the existing social order. He believed that this race war was inevitable and that his role was to help trigger it through strategic acts of violence that would be blamed on black revolutionaries, thereby provoking white retaliation and escalating the conflict. Manson taught his followers that they would survive this apocalyptic conflict by hiding in a bottomless pit located in Death Valley, where they would wait until the war had concluded and black Americans had emerged victorious but proved incapable of governing themselves. At that point, Manson and his followers would emerge to take control of the surviving population and establish a new social order with Manson as its supreme leader. This elaborate fantasy served multiple purposes within the family's social structure. It provided a grandiose mission that gave meaning to the followers' otherwise aimless lives, justified criminal behavior as necessary preparation for the coming conflict, and positioned Manson as a prophetic figure whose commands must be followed without question to ensure the group's survival. The helter-skelter philosophy also incorporated various elements of popular culture, religious imagery, and political rhetoric that were familiar to the followers, making the fantasy seem more plausible and compelling. Manson was skilled at weaving together disparate cultural references in ways that created the impression of hidden knowledge and prophetic insight. The gradual introduction and reinforcement of these beliefs created a shared delusional system that isolated the family from mainstream society while providing justification for increasingly extreme actions. By the time the murders were committed, the followers had been so thoroughly indoctrinated in this worldview that they genuinely believed they were participating in a historic mission to save humanity. The transition from criminal activity to murder within the Manson family was gradual but deliberate, representing Manson's systematic desensitization of his followers to violence and his testing of their absolute loyalty to his commands. The process began with relatively minor acts of violence and gradually escalated to the brutal murders that would make the family infamous. One of the first serious violent incidents occurred in July 1969, when family member Bobby Beausoleil killed music teacher Gary Hinman during a robbery attempt. While this murder was initially motivated by financial gain rather than the helter-skelter philosophy, it served as a crucial test of the family's willingness to protect one of their own and established precedents for covering up serious crimes. The Hinman murder also demonstrated Manson's ability to manipulate events from behind the scenes while maintaining plausible deniability for his direct involvement. Although he was present during parts of the incident and clearly directed the overall operation, he carefully avoided being the person who actually committed the murder, establishing a pattern he would follow in subsequent crimes. The successful cover-up of the Hinman murder, at least initially, emboldened Manson and convinced him that his followers were ready for the more dramatic acts of violence that would be necessary to trigger helter-skelter. The murder also provided practical experience in killing and disposing of evidence that would prove valuable in planning future crimes. During this period, Manson became increasingly frustrated with what he saw as the slow pace of social change and the failure of the predicted race war to materialize spontaneously. His impatience led him to conclude that more dramatic action would be necessary to trigger the apocalyptic events he had prophesied, setting the stage for the brutal murders that would follow. The psychological preparation of his followers for murder involved a combination of dehumanizing potential victims, emphasizing the historic importance of their mission, and gradually normalizing violence through exposure to increasingly extreme ideas and behaviors. By August 1969, several family members had been sufficiently conditioned to carry out Manson's murderous commands without hesitation. On the evening of August 8, 1969, Charles Manson dispatched 4 of his followers, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Linda Kasabian, and Charles Tex Watson, to commit what would become one of the most notorious mass murders in American history. Their target was 10050 Cielo Drive in Benedict Canyon, a secluded house that Manson had visited previously when it was occupied by music producer Terry Melcher. The selection of this particular house was not random but reflected Manson's complex motivations and his desire to send a message to the entertainment industry that had rejected his musical ambitions. Melcher, the son of actress Doris Day, had previously shown interest in Manson's music but had ultimately decided not to offer him a recording contract, a rejection that Manson interpreted as a personal betrayal. At the time of the murders, the house was being rented by film director Roman Polanski and his wife, actress Sharon Tate, who was 8.5 months pregnant. Polanski was in London working on a film, leaving Tate at home with friends who had gathered for what should have been a pleasant evening together. The 4 family members arrived at the property after midnight on August 9, 1969, armed with knives, a gun, and a length of rope. Their instructions from Manson were to kill everyone in the house and make the scene as gruesome as possible to shock the public and generate media attention that would help trigger the race war he envisioned. The first victim was Stephen Parent, an 18-year-old student who was leaving the property after visiting the caretaker in the guest house. Watson shot Parent multiple times as he sat in his car, killing him instantly in what was essentially a random act of violence against someone who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The 4 attackers then entered the main house, where they encountered Tate and her 3 friends, Abigail Folger, heir to the Folgers' coffee fortune, Wojciech Frykowski, a Polish writer and producer, and Jay Sebring, a prominent Hollywood hairstylist. What followed was a prolonged and brutal attack that involved stabbing, shooting, and beating that continued long after the victims had died. The extreme violence employed in these murders went far beyond what was necessary to kill the victims and reflected both the psychological conditioning the attackers had undergone and their desire to create a scene that would generate maximum shock and media attention. The attackers wrote messages in blood on the walls, including the word "pig," as part of their effort to make the crimes appear to be politically motivated. Not satisfied with the carnage at Cielo Drive, Charles Manson decided to direct a second night of murders, this time personally leading a group of followers to ensure that his vision for triggering Helter Skelter was properly executed. On the evening of August 9, 1969, just hours after the Tate murders, Manson drove to the Los Feliz area of Los Angeles with several family members. The target of this second attack was a middle-class house occupied by Leno LaBianca, a 44-year-old grocery store executive, and his 38-year-old wife Rosemary, who operated a dress shop. The LaBiancas were chosen randomly, simply because Manson had noticed their house during a previous drive through the neighborhood and decided it would be suitable for his purposes. Manson's direct involvement in the LaBianca murders distinguished them from the Cielo Drive killings and demonstrated his willingness to personally participate in violence when he felt it was necessary to achieve his goals. He entered the house first, subduing the couple and reassuring them that no harm would come to them if they cooperated, a lie designed to prevent resistance that might complicate the planned murders. After securing the victims, Manson left the house and sent in Leslie Van Houten, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Charles Watson to carry out the actual killings. His decision to leave before the murders were committed was consistent with his pattern of maintaining plausible deniability while ensuring that his followers were fully committed to criminal acts that would bind them to him. The murder of the LaBiancas was even more brutal and ritualistic than the Cielo Drive killings, involving extensive stabbing and mutilation that continued long after the victims had died. The attackers carved the word, war, into Leno LaBianca's abdomen and wrote various messages on the walls in the victim's blood, including, "Death to pigs," and, "Helter Skelter." The ritualistic elements of the LaBianca murders reflected Manson's belief that these crimes would serve as a catalyst for the race war he envisioned. The messages written in blood were specifically chosen to make the crimes appear to be the work of black revolutionaries, thereby provoking white retaliation and escalating racial tensions as Manson had planned. The discovery of the bodies at both crime scenes shocked law enforcement and the public, generating intense media attention and launching one of the largest murder investigations in Los Angeles history. The brutal nature of the crimes and the apparent randomness of the victim selection created widespread fear and paranoia throughout the city. Initial investigative efforts were hampered by the assumption that the crimes were connected to drug dealing or other criminal activities associated with the Hollywood lifestyle. The wealth and celebrity status of some of the victims led investigators to focus on possible motives related to business disputes, romantic relationships, or criminal enterprises rather than the apocalyptic cult violence that had actually motivated the murders. The investigation was further complicated by jurisdictional issues, as the Cielo Drive murders fell under the Los Angeles Police Department's jurisdiction while the LaBianca killings were investigated by the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. This division of responsibility led to initial failures in communication and coordination that delayed the recognition of connections between the two crime scenes. Physical evidence at both scenes was extensive but initially difficult to interpret without understanding the underlying motivations for the crimes. The bloody messages written at both locations were analyzed for their potential significance, but without knowledge of the helter-skelter philosophy, investigators were unable to understand their true meaning and purpose. The breakthrough in the case came not from the investigation of the murders themselves but from the arrest of several family members on unrelated charges. Susan Atkins, who had participated in both nights of killing, was arrested on charges related to the earlier murder of Gary Hinman and eventually confessed to her involvement in the Tate and LaBianca murders while in custody. Atkins' confession provided investigators with their first detailed account of the murders and revealed the existence of the Manson family as a criminal organization responsible for multiple homicides. Her revelations about Manson's role in directing the murders and his apocalyptic philosophy provided the key to understanding the true motivations behind the crimes. Armed with Susan Atkins' confession and growing evidence of the Manson family's criminal activities, law enforcement agencies launched an intensive manhunt to capture Manson and his remaining followers. The investigation revealed the scope of the family's criminal enterprise and led to raids on several properties where family members were believed to be hiding. The arrest of Charles Manson occurred on October 12, 1969, during a raid on the Barker Ranch in Death Valley, where he and several followers had taken refuge while attempting to evade capture. Ironically, Manson was initially arrested on charges related to arson and auto theft rather than murder, but these charges provided law enforcement with the opportunity to hold him while building the murder case. The capture of Manson and his followers was facilitated by their increasingly erratic behavior and their inability to maintain the discipline and security that had previously protected them from law enforcement attention. The psychological pressure of being fugitives, combined with their continued drug use and paranoid beliefs, made them increasingly vulnerable to detection and arrest. Charles Watson, who had played a central role in both nights of murders, initially evaded capture by fleeing to his home state of Texas, where he fought extradition to California for several months. His eventual return to California was crucial to the prosecution's case, as his testimony provided detailed accounts of the murders and Manson's role in planning and directing them. The arrests of family members were accompanied by searches of their various hideouts and meeting places, which yielded additional evidence linking them to the murders and other criminal activities. These searches also revealed the extent of the family's weapons cache and their preparations for the apocalyptic conflict they believed was imminent. Media coverage of the arrests was extensive and often sensationalistic, contributing to public fascination with the case and helping to establish Manson as a symbol of the dark side of the 1960s counterculture movement. The dramatic nature of the crimes and the bizarre motivations behind them captured public attention in ways that transformed the case into a cultural phenomenon beyond its legal significance. The trial of Charles Manson and his co-defendants began in June 1970 and quickly became one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in American history. The case presented unique challenges for both prosecutors and defense attorneys due to the complex relationships among the defendants, the bizarre nature of their motivations, and the intense public interest in the outcome. Prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi faced the difficult task of proving that Manson was responsible for murders he had not personally committed, requiring him to establish the concept of conspiracy and demonstrate Manson's psychological control over his followers. This legal strategy necessitated extensive testimony about the family's lifestyle, beliefs, and internal dynamics. The prosecution's case relied heavily on testimony from Linda Kasabian, who had participated in both nights of murders but had not personally killed anyone. Kasabian's decision to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for immunity provided crucial eyewitness testimony about the crimes and Manson's role in planning and directing them. The defense strategy was complicated by the defendants' continued loyalty to Manson and their apparent desire to protect him even at the cost of their own freedom. This loyalty manifested in various ways throughout the trial, including attempts to take sole responsibility for the crimes and bizarre courtroom behavior designed to disrupt the proceedings. Manson's own behavior during the trial became a spectacle that often overshadowed the legal proceedings themselves. He frequently disrupted court sessions with outbursts, attempted to represent himself, and used media attention to promote his apocalyptic philosophy and maintain his image as a countercultural prophet. The female defendants' behavior was equally disruptive and reflected their continued psychological subjugation to Manson's influence. They often mirrored his behavior, supported his statements, and demonstrated through their actions that they remained under his psychological control even while facing potential death sentences. The trial provided unprecedented insight into the psychology of cult leadership and follower mentality, with expert witnesses testifying about mind control techniques, group dynamics, and the psychological factors that had enabled Manson to exert such complete control over his followers' behavior. On January 25, 1971, after one of the longest trials in California history, Charles Manson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten were found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The convictions represented a significant victory for the prosecution and validation of their legal strategy for holding Manson responsible for crimes committed by his followers. The guilt phase of the trial was followed by a penalty phase in which the jury was asked to decide whether the defendants should receive death sentences or life imprisonment. This phase of the proceedings provided additional opportunities for both sides to present evidence and arguments about the appropriate punishment for these extraordinary crimes. The prosecution argued that the brutal nature of the murders, the lack of remorse shown by the defendants, and the ongoing danger they posed to society justified the ultimate punishment. They emphasized the random selection of victims and the apocalyptic motivations behind the crimes as factors that made these murders particularly heinous and deserving of death sentences. The defense attempted to present mitigating evidence about the defendants' backgrounds and their psychological subjugation to Manson's influence, arguing that their youth and the manipulative environment they had experienced should be considered in determining their sentences. However, their continued loyalty to Manson undermined these arguments and reinforced perceptions that they remained dangerous. On March 29, 1971, all four defendants were sentenced to death, though these sentences were later commuted to life imprisonment when California temporarily abolished capital punishment in 1972. The sentences reflected both the severity of the crimes and society's judgment that these individuals posed a continuing threat that required permanent incarceration. Charles Watson was tried separately due to his fight against extradition and was also convicted of murder and sentenced to death, later commuted to life imprisonment. His trial provided additional details about the murders and confirmed the prosecution's version of events, though it attracted less media attention than the original Manson trial. The Manson family murders had a profound and lasting impact on American culture that extended far beyond their legal significance. The crimes occurred at a time when American society was already deeply divided over issues including the Vietnam War, civil rights, and generational conflicts, and they served to intensify existing fears and anxieties about social change. The murders effectively ended the naive optimism of the 1960s counterculture movement and forced a re-evaluation of the hippie lifestyle and communal living experiments that had become popular during that era. The fact that the crimes had been committed by individuals who superficially resembled peace-loving hippies challenged assumptions about the benign nature of alternative lifestyles. Media coverage of the case was extensive and often sensationalistic, contributing to public fascination with Manson and helping to establish him as a cultural icon representing the dark side of the 1960s. This coverage often emphasized the most bizarre and shocking aspects of the case while paying less attention to the psychological and social factors that had enabled the crimes. The case contributed to growing public concern about cults and alternative religious movements, leading to increased scrutiny of such groups and their leaders. The Manson family became a prototype for understanding how charismatic leaders could exploit vulnerable individuals and manipulate them into committing extreme acts of violence. The murders also had a significant impact on the entertainment industry, particularly in Hollywood, where they created lasting anxiety about personal security and the vulnerability of celebrities to random violence. The fact that the crimes had specifically targeted individuals associated with the film industry added an additional layer of meaning to their cultural significance. Academic interest in the case led to extensive research into cult psychology, mind control techniques, and the social dynamics that enable mass violence. The Manson family became a case study for understanding how ordinary individuals can be transformed into killers through psychological manipulation and social pressure. The Manson family case provides one of the most extensively documented examples of mind control and psychological manipulation in modern history. Charles Manson's ability to transform ordinary young people into willing participants in brutal murders offers crucial insights into the psychological mechanisms that enable cult leaders to exert such complete control over their followers. Manson employed a sophisticated combination of techniques designed to break down his followers' psychological defenses and replace their individual identities with complete identification with the group and its mission. These techniques included isolation from outside influences, constant indoctrination, manipulation of basic needs like food and shelter, and the systematic use of drugs to alter consciousness and increase suggestibility. The recruitment process targeted individuals who were particularly vulnerable to manipulation, including young people estranged from their families, individuals struggling with drug problems or mental health issues, and those searching for meaning and belonging in their lives. These vulnerabilities provided entry points that Manson could exploit to begin the process of psychological control. Once individuals were drawn into the family, Manson used various techniques to deepen their psychological dependence and commitment to the group. These included the creation of artificial families with Manson as the ultimate father figure, the manipulation of sexual relationships to prevent the formation of competing loyalties, and the gradual introduction of criminal activities that bound followers through shared guilt. The use of drugs, particularly LSD, was crucial to Manson's control system, as these substances made followers more susceptible to his influence while simultaneously creating experiences that he could interpret and define according to his own agenda. The combination of drugs with sleep deprivation, poor nutrition, and constant psychological pressure created a state of mental confusion and dependency that was extremely difficult to escape. The development of the helter-skelter philosophy provided a framework that gave meaning to the followers' experiences while justifying their complete submission to Manson's authority. This belief system created a sense of historic mission and cosmic significance that made ordinary moral considerations seem irrelevant in the face of their apocalyptic destiny. The human cost of the Manson family murders extended far beyond the immediate victims to include family members, friends, and communities whose lives were forever changed by these senseless acts of violence. Understanding the impact on victims and survivors is crucial to comprehending the full scope of harm caused by Manson and his followers. Sharon Tate, who was 8.5 months pregnant at the time of her murder, became the most famous victim of the Manson killings, partly due to her celebrity status but also because of the particular tragedy of her death. Her unborn son, whom she had planned to name Paul, was also killed in the attack, making her murder especially heartbreaking and symbolic of innocence destroyed. Sharon's mother, Doris Tate, became a powerful advocate for victims' rights and played a crucial role in ensuring that the Manson family members remained in prison when they became eligible for parole hearings. Her tireless efforts to keep the killers incarcerated helped establish the principle that victims' families should have a voice in parole decisions. Jay Sebring, one of Hollywood's most successful hairstylists, had built a thriving business and was known for his kindness and generosity to others. His murder robbed the entertainment industry of a talented professional and his family and friends of a beloved individual who had worked hard to achieve success through legitimate means. Abigail Folger, heir to the Folgers coffee fortune, was actively involved in social causes and civil rights work at the time of her death. Her murder was particularly tragic because she was using her wealth and privilege to help others and work for social justice, making her death a loss not only to her family but to the causes she supported. Wojciech Frykowski, a Polish writer and aspiring producer, had come to America seeking opportunities in the entertainment industry. His murder represented the destruction of dreams and ambitions as well as the loss of life, and his death was particularly devastating to his family in Poland who had supported his American ventures. Stephen Parent, the youngest victim at just 18 years old, was a college student with no connection to the other victims who was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. His random murder highlighted the senseless nature of the killings and the fact that no one was safe from the family's violence. Following their convictions and sentencing, the members of the Manson family began serving life sentences in the California prison system, where they have remained for more than 5 decades. Their continued incarceration has provided ongoing opportunities to study the long-term effects of cult involvement and the possibility of rehabilitation for individuals who committed such extreme crimes. Charles Manson was initially housed at San Quentin State Prison and later transferred to other maximum security facilities within the California system. Throughout his incarceration, he continued to attract media attention and maintained a following of individuals fascinated by his philosophy and crimes, demonstrating the lasting impact of his charismatic personality. Manson's behavior in prison was consistently problematic, including multiple disciplinary violations, attempts to manipulate staff and other inmates, and continued expressions of his apocalyptic beliefs. His inability to adapt to prison life or show genuine remorse for his crimes reinforced assessments that he remained a danger to society. The female members of the family presented different challenges to the prison system, as their crimes were unprecedented for women and their continued loyalty to Manson complicated efforts at rehabilitation. Over time, some of them began to distance themselves from Manson's influence and express remorse for their actions, though this process took many years. Parole hearings for the family members became major media events that attracted extensive coverage and public attention. These proceedings provided forums for examining the continued dangerousness of the killers and the possibility of their rehabilitation, while also allowing victims' families to express their views about potential releases. The testimony of Doris Tate and other family members at these parole hearings was instrumental in keeping the killers incarcerated and helped establish the principle that victims' families should have meaningful input into parole decisions. Their powerful statements about the lasting impact of the crimes provided compelling arguments against release. Charles Manson died on November 19, 2017, at the age of 83, while serving his life sentence at Corcoran State Prison in California. His death marked the end of one of the most notorious criminal careers in American history and provided an opportunity for reflection on the lasting impact of his crimes and the cultural phenomenon he had become. Manson's death was the result of natural causes related to his advanced age and various health problems that had accumulated during his decades of incarceration. Despite numerous rumors and conspiracy theories, there was no evidence that his death was anything other than the natural conclusion of a long life spent primarily in institutional settings. The reaction to Manson's death varied significantly, with some expressing relief that he could no longer attract media attention or inspire followers, while others worried that his death might transform him into a martyr for individuals attracted to his philosophy. Most observers agreed that his death closed an important chapter in American criminal history. Media coverage of Manson's death was extensive and provided opportunities for retrospective analysis of his crimes and their lasting impact on American society. Many commentators noted that while Manson himself was gone, the cultural questions raised by his crimes remained relevant to contemporary discussions about cult behavior, mass violence, and social alienation. The death also prompted renewed interest in the surviving family members and their potential for parole, as Manson's continued opposition to their release was no longer a factor in their cases. This raised questions about whether his death might affect the likelihood of their eventual release from prison. For the families of Manson's victims, his death provided a form of closure while also serving as a reminder of the lasting impact of his crimes. Many family members expressed relief that he could no longer use media attention to continue promoting his destructive philosophy. More than 5 decades after the murders, the Manson family case continues to exert a significant influence on American culture, criminal justice practices, and academic understanding of cult behavior and mass violence. The case remains a touchstone for discussions about the capacity for evil within human nature and the social conditions that can enable such extreme criminal behavior. The case established important legal precedents regarding conspiracy charges and the prosecution of individuals who direct others to commit crimes without personally participating in the actual violence. The successful prosecution of Manson despite his absence from the crime scenes demonstrated that criminal liability could extend to those who exercise psychological control over others and direct their criminal activities. Academic research into the Manson family has contributed significantly to understanding of cult psychology, mind control techniques, and the social dynamics that enable mass violence. The case has become a standard reference point in criminology, psychology, and sociology courses that examine these phenomena, providing students with detailed documentation of how ordinary individuals can be transformed into killers. Law enforcement agencies have used lessons learned from the Manson case to improve their understanding of cult-related crimes and develop better strategies for investigating and preventing such incidents. The case highlighted the importance of understanding the psychological dynamics within criminal organizations and the role of charismatic leadership in enabling extreme violence. The entertainment industry has continued to find the Manson story compelling, producing numerous films, documentaries, books, and television programs that examine different aspects of the case. While this attention has educational value, it has also raised concerns about the potential glorification of Manson and his crimes. The case has had a lasting impact on public attitudes toward alternative lifestyles, communal living, and countercultural movements. The association between the hippie lifestyle and the Manson murders contributed to a broader conservative backlash against 1960s social movements and influenced political discourse for decades. As of 2024, several members of the Manson family remain incarcerated in California prisons, where they continue to serve life sentences for their roles in the murders. Their cases have provided ongoing opportunities to examine questions of rehabilitation, the possibility of redemption, and the appropriate length of punishment for the most serious crimes. Patricia Krenwinkel, who participated in both the Tate and LaBianca murders, has been incarcerated for over 5 decades and has been denied parole multiple times. During her imprisonment, she has participated in various educational and therapeutic programs and has expressed remorse for her crimes, though parole boards have consistently concluded that she remains a danger to society. Leslie Van Houten, who participated in the LaBianca murders, has also served more than 50 years in prison and has similarly been denied parole repeatedly despite evidence of her rehabilitation and expressions of genuine remorse. Her case has generated particular debate because she was the youngest family member at the time of the crimes, and some argue that she deserves consideration for release based on her age when the crimes were committed. Susan Atkins, who played a central role in the Tate murders and whose confession helped solve the case, died in prison in 2009 after serving nearly 40 years of her life sentence. Her death occurred while she was terminally ill with brain cancer, and despite requests for compassionate release due to her medical condition, she remained incarcerated until her death. Charles "Tex" Watson, who was the primary killer in both nights of murders, remains incarcerated and has been denied parole multiple times. Despite his claims of religious conversion and rehabilitation, parole boards have consistently found that the severity of his crimes and his central role in the murders make him unsuitable for release. The parole hearings for these individuals have become important venues for ongoing discussions about criminal justice philosophy, the purposes of imprisonment, and the possibility of redemption for those who commit the most heinous crimes. These proceedings continue to attract media attention and public interest decades after the original crimes. The Manson family murders occurred at a time when victims' rights were not well established in the American criminal justice system, and the families of the victims had to fight for the right to participate meaningfully in legal proceedings and parole hearings. Their advocacy efforts have had a lasting impact on criminal justice practices and helped establish important principles about victims' roles in the justice process. Doris Tate, Sharon Tate's mother, became one of the most prominent victims' rights advocates in American history through her efforts to ensure that the Manson killers remained in prison. Her powerful testimony at parole hearings and her work to change laws regarding victims' rights helped establish the principle that victims and their families should have a voice in criminal justice proceedings. The Tate family's advocacy efforts contributed to the passage of various victims' rights laws in California and other states, including provisions requiring notification of parole hearings, the right to submit victim impact statements, and the right to be present during various legal proceedings. These changes have benefited countless other crime victims and their families. Patty Tate, Sharon's sister, continued her mother's advocacy work after Doris's death in 1992, ensuring that the family's voice continued to be heard at parole hearings and in discussions about criminal justice policy. Her efforts have helped maintain public awareness of the continuing impact of the murders on the victims' families. The work of the Tate family and other victims' advocates has helped transform the criminal justice system's approach to victim participation and has ensured that the voices of those harmed by crime are heard alongside concerns about offender rehabilitation and public safety. This transformation represents one of the most positive legacies of the tragic events of 1969. The ongoing advocacy efforts have also served to keep public attention focused on the victims rather than allowing the perpetrators to dominate media coverage and public discourse about the case. This shift in focus has helped ensure that the human cost of the crimes remains central to discussions about their significance and meaning. The Manson family case has generated extensive psychological research and analysis that has contributed significantly to understanding of cult behavior, mind control, group dynamics, and the factors that can lead ordinary individuals to commit extraordinary acts of violence. The detailed documentation of the family's activities and beliefs has provided researchers with an unprecedented opportunity to study these phenomena. Studies of the psychological techniques employed by Manson have revealed sophisticated methods for breaking down individual psychological defenses and creating dependency relationships that enabled him to control his followers' behavior completely. These techniques have been analyzed and categorized to help mental health professionals identify similar patterns in other contexts. Research into the backgrounds and personalities of family members has provided insights into the types of individuals who are most vulnerable to cult recruitment and manipulation. This research has identified risk factors including social isolation, family dysfunction, substance abuse problems, and certain personality characteristics that increase susceptibility to coercive influence. The process by which family members were gradually desensitized to violence and conditioned to commit murder has been studied as an example of how normal moral inhibitions can be overcome through systematic psychological manipulation. This research has implications for understanding not only cult violence but also other forms of organized criminal behavior and mass violence. Psychological evaluations of the family members conducted during their trials and throughout their incarceration have provided longitudinal data about the long-term effects of cult involvement and the possibility of recovery from intensive psychological manipulation. These studies have informed treatment approaches for former cult members and other victims of coercive control. The case has also contributed to research into the psychology of charismatic leadership and the personality characteristics that enable some individuals to exert extraordinary influence over others. Studies of Manson's personality and methods have helped identify warning signs of potentially dangerous cult leaders. The Manson family murders have been the subject of countless books, films, documentaries, television programs, and other media representations that have shaped public understanding of the case and its significance. The way these crimes have been portrayed in popular culture reveals important insights into American attitudes toward violence, celebrity, and moral responsibility. Early media coverage of the case was often sensationalistic and focused on the most shocking aspects of the crimes and the bizarre lifestyle of the family. This coverage helped establish Manson as a cultural icon while sometimes obscuring the more complex psychological and social factors that enabled the murders. Hollywood's treatment of the Manson story has evolved over time, with different films and television programs emphasizing various aspects of the case depending on the cultural context in which they were produced. Some representations have focused on the victims and the impact of the crimes, while others have been criticized for glorifying or romanticizing the perpetrators. Documentary treatments of the case have generally been more analytical and have contributed to public understanding of the psychological dynamics within the family and the methods Manson used to control his followers. These productions have often included interviews with surviving family members, law enforcement officials, and experts in cult behavior. The proliferation of media representations has raised important questions about the ethics of depicting real crimes and the potential impact of such portrayals on public attitudes and behavior. Critics have argued that excessive focus on the perpetrators can inadvertently glorify their actions or inspire copycat crimes. Academic analysis of media representations of the Manson case has revealed patterns in how American culture processes and understands extreme violence, particularly when it involves charismatic criminals and vulnerable victims. These studies have contributed to broader understanding of the relationship between media, crime, and public perception. The Manson family case can be usefully compared with other instances of cult-related violence to identify common patterns and unique features that contribute to understanding of these phenomena. Such comparative analysis has revealed both similarities and differences in how cult leaders manipulate followers and the conditions that can lead to extreme violence. The Jonestown Massacre of 1978, in which over 900 members of the People's Temple died in a mass murder-suicide directed by Jim Jones, shares certain characteristics with the Manson case, including charismatic leadership, psychological manipulation, and the creation of isolated communities where normal social controls were suspended. However, the Jonestown tragedy differed from the Manson murders in that the violence was primarily directed inward against the cult members themselves rather than outward against randomly selected victims. This difference reflects different cult philosophies and leader personalities, though both cases involved the systematic breakdown of followers' psychological autonomy. The Branch Davidian standoff at Waco in 1993 represents another example of cult-related violence, though in this case the violence occurred in the context of a confrontation with law enforcement rather than as part of a planned campaign of murder. The psychological dynamics within the Branch Davidian community shared certain features with the Manson family, including absolute leader authority and apocalyptic beliefs. More recent cases of cult-related violence, such as the Aum Shinrikyo sarin gas attacks in Japan, demonstrate that the basic patterns identified in the Manson case continue to manifest in different cultural contexts. These international examples suggest that the psychological mechanisms underlying cult violence are universal rather than specifically American phenomena. Comparative analysis has also revealed the importance of specific historical and cultural contexts in shaping the particular forms that cult violence takes. The Manson murders occurred during a period of social upheaval and cultural experimentation that provided both the ideological raw material for Manson's philosophy and the vulnerable population he needed to recruit as followers. The investigation of the Manson family murders revealed both strengths and weaknesses in law enforcement practices of the late 1960s and contributed to significant improvements in how complex criminal cases are investigated and prosecuted. The case has become a standard reference point for training law enforcement officers in the investigation of serial crimes and cult-related violence. The initial investigation was hampered by jurisdictional divisions, communication problems between different agencies, and investigators' failure to recognize the connections between the various crimes. These problems led to reforms in multi-jurisdictional cooperation and information sharing that have improved law enforcement effectiveness in complex cases. The breakthrough in the case came through traditional police work, the arrest of suspects on unrelated charges that led to confessions and the unraveling of the larger conspiracy. This demonstrates the continued importance of basic investigative techniques even in complex cases involving unusual motivations and criminal organizations. The prosecution of the case established important legal precedents regarding conspiracy charges and the use of co-conspirator testimony to establish criminal liability. These precedents have been applied in numerous subsequent cases involving organized crime, terrorism, and other forms of criminal conspiracy. The case also highlighted the importance of understanding the psychological dynamics within criminal organizations and the role of charismatic leadership in enabling and directing criminal activity. This understanding has informed law enforcement approaches to investigating and prosecuting similar organizations. Modern law enforcement agencies have incorporated lessons learned from the Manson case into training programs for investigators working on cases involving cults, domestic terrorism, and other forms of organized criminal activity. These programs emphasize the importance of understanding the ideological motivations and group dynamics that can drive such crimes. The Manson family case raises profound philosophical and ethical questions about the nature of evil, moral responsibility, free will, and the capacity for both corruption and redemption within human nature. These questions have been debated by philosophers, theologians, legal scholars, and ethicists for decades since the crimes occurred. One of the central questions raised by the case concerns the extent to which the family members can be held morally responsible for their actions given the intensive psychological manipulation they experienced under Manson's influence. This question has implications for understanding criminal responsibility more generally and the relationship between coercion and moral culpability. The case also raises questions about the nature of evil and whether individuals like Manson represent a fundamental corruption of human nature or the result of specific psychological and social factors that could theoretically be prevented or treated. These questions have theological as well as psychological dimensions and touch on fundamental beliefs about human nature. The possibility of redemption and rehabilitation for individuals who commit such extreme crimes is another ethical question raised by the case. The continued incarceration of the surviving family members decades after their crimes raises questions about the purposes of punishment and the possibility of moral transformation. The role of society in creating the conditions that enabled Manson to recruit followers and develop his criminal organization is another ethical dimension of the case. Some critics have argued that the social upheaval and alienation of the 1960s created vulnerabilities that predators like Manson could exploit. The extensive media attention devoted to the case and the ongoing fascination with Manson and his crimes raise questions about society's relationship with evil and violence. Critics have argued that this attention can inadvertently glorify criminal behavior and potentially inspire copycat crimes. The Charles Manson and family murders represent one of the most disturbing and significant criminal cases in American history, not only because of the brutality of the crimes themselves but because of what they revealed about the capacity for evil within human nature and the social conditions that can enable such extreme violence. More than 5 decades after the murders, the case continues to generate intense interest and debate about its meaning and significance. The transformation of ordinary young people into willing participants in brutal murders under Manson's influence demonstrates the power of psychological manipulation and the vulnerability of individuals seeking meaning and belonging in their lives. The case serves as a powerful warning about the dangers of charismatic leadership unconstrained by moral principles and the potential for ideology to justify the most extreme acts of violence. The victims of these crimes, Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, Wojciech Frykowski, Stephen Parent, Leno LaBianca, and Rosemary LaBianca, must be remembered not as mere footnotes to Manson's story but as individuals whose lives were cut short by senseless violence. Their deaths represent not only personal tragedies but also the destruction of potential contributions they might have made to society. The investigation and prosecution of the case demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of the American criminal justice system in dealing with unprecedented crimes. The successful convictions of Manson and his followers, despite the complex legal and evidentiary challenges presented by the case, vindicated the principle that even the most charismatic criminals can be held accountable for their actions. The ongoing incarceration of the surviving family members reflects society's judgment that some crimes are so heinous and some individuals so dangerous that they must be permanently separated from the community. Their continued imprisonment, despite decades of incarceration, demonstrates the lasting consequences of choosing to participate in extreme violence. The cultural impact of the case extends far beyond its legal significance to broader questions about American society, the counterculture movement of the 1960s, and the social conditions that can enable mass violence. The case marked the end of an era of innocence and optimism while highlighting the persistent potential for evil within human nature. For students of criminology, psychology, and American history, the Manson family case provides crucial insights into the dynamics of cult behavior, the psychology of mass violence, and the social factors that can contribute to criminal behavior. The extensive documentation of the case and the ongoing research it has generated continue to contribute to understanding of these important phenomena. The case also demonstrates the importance of victims' rights advocacy and the crucial role that survivors and family members can play in ensuring that justice is served and that the voices of victims are heard in criminal justice proceedings. The work of the Tate family and other advocates has had a lasting impact on criminal justice practices and has helped countless other crime victims. Perhaps most importantly, the Manson family case serves as a reminder of the fragility of civilization and the constant vigilance required to protect society from those who would exploit vulnerability and manipulate others for destructive purposes. The case illustrates both the depths to which human beings can sink and the strength and resilience that communities can demonstrate in responding to tragedy. The story of Charles Manson and the family is ultimately a story about the consequences of choices, the choice to exploit rather than help vulnerable individuals, the choice to follow charismatic leaders without question, and the choice to use violence as a means of achieving personal or ideological goals. Understanding these choices and their consequences remains crucial for preventing similar tragedies in the future. While the immediate perpetrators of these crimes have been held accountable through the criminal justice system, the broader questions raised by the case about human nature, social responsibility, and the prevention of mass violence remain relevant to contemporary discussions about cult behavior, domestic terrorism, and the protection of vulnerable individuals from exploitation. The legacy of the Manson family murders continues to influence American culture, criminal justice practices, and academic understanding of extreme criminal behavior. As new generations discover this case and grapple with its implications, it will undoubtedly continue to serve as a crucial reference point for understanding some of the darkest aspects of human nature and the ongoing challenge of building a just and safe society. This case study represents one of the most significant and complex criminal cases in American history. The detailed examination of Charles Manson's methods, the family's crimes, and their lasting impact provides crucial insights into cult psychology, mass violence, and the criminal justice system's response to unprecedented challenges. The lessons learned from this case continue to influence law enforcement, legal practice, and academic research into the nature of extreme criminal behavior and the social conditions that can enable such tragedies.